So let's get going. It's great to welcome folks here on Zoom and on LinkedIn Live. And my name is Michael Goldberg. I am our Executive Director of the Veale Institute for Entrepreneurship here at Case Western Reserve University. I'm also a professor at the Weatherhead School of Management. It's great to welcome back to campus, at least virtually, Peter Johnson. Peter and I actually met through one of our earlier speaker events last year, and been following his work. And most recently, our good friend and colleague, Bob Smith from the Case Alumni Association, wrote an excellent piece in the Alumni magazine about some of the work that Peter has done recently on the Polish border with Ukrainian refugees. That was really inspiring, and thrilled today to welcome him to our speaker series. All of our sessions are moderated by students. Our student moderator will be hopefully joining shortly, but in the absence of Franco joining, I will play the role of moderator, which I have been known to do at times until I outsourced it all to students. So Peter, maybe you can, just by starting things off, just give a little bit of your background from your days as an undergraduate at Case, the kind of career journey and kind of your involvement in this sort of, broadly speaking, entrepreneurial world before we get into the work that you did.
Okay, absolutely. That's my career journey is wow. That's a difficult one. I'll try to keep it short. But at Case Western Reserve, I was a systems engineer, and so mathematical modeling, simulation, optimization, and it really fits the way my mind works. Just how does everything fit together? What parts are playing a different function and pulling things in. So my career has been very diverse and avoiding going down a rabbit hole that will take up the entire time. But I've been fortunate that I started my career in consulting, but I've been fortunate. I've worked for some startups, I've worked for some big companies. And probably the one most common theme is most of the time I'm involved in, whether it's a new initiative or a new business process redesign or whatever it is, it's getting to be that person that gets a little bit of an entrepreneurial flexibility to not be having to do the day-to-day job, but to step back, look at what's happening and say, how can we improve this? Or what can help this? What's the biggest issue, or what's the biggest opportunity to overcome? So very diverse career. I'm definitely open to, if anyone ever wants to talk about some of what I've done, open to that. But I've been across the board, primarily in either industry, implementing systems and new business processes, or with providers. They're either consulting or providing new technologies or business processes for companies, and then helping ramp up those, whether it's the sales of new solutions, or if it's the implementation and the adoption of new projects, initiatives, processes, whatever it may be. So, and then just the quick touch base, maybe, I worked Price Waterhouse. On industry side, I worked with Cargill and Alcoa. On the provider side, worked with Free Markets, and a long stretch with SAP. And then there's a couple other small engagements that I had in between. And most recently, I've been doing just working, mentoring a lot of startups, and really looking for opportunities to drive change at macro level. And without getting too much into that, we've all kind of seen the increasing inequity, and there's a lot of, social things, and trying to look at, what are the factors that might, if there's a lever we can pull that can help have greater macro effects, what might that be? And in that search, I got connected with a bunch of PhD psychologists that do leadership training all around the world. And they call themselves the Hope Makers. And I randomly got connected to them. They were having an offsite meeting for 1 week. And they basically had Johnson & Johnson had asked them, we want to train every employee around the world on how do we deliver hope? How do we give hope to ourselves, to each other, to, our customers, the communities we operate in, the whole world? How do we just, and that's it, it's a very high level. We want to see what imagination comes back. And so basically they're trying to figure out how can companies be change agents for a better world. That's a very broad brush statement. And I was like, look, I'm intrigued because I think companies have the ability to be change agents more so than government. I think it needs to, come from the business world. Went up there, and that's where I met the co-founder, Nina Meyerhoff of One Humanity Institute, and just didn't really know a lot of the One Humanity Institute, but met her, really clicked with her. She's really down to earth, but driven, smart as a whip. If you met her, you wouldn't realize she's in her 80s. She's like a hummingbird on caffeine, and she's just awesome. And so, and basically the story was she, a few months later, said, hey, look, we're going to update our website. We're going to start developing a pitch deck, for this new nonprofit One Humanity Institute. We've been working on it for years, but we've never really gone out for fundraising. We're hoping to start that process in about a year. And I said, look, I've seen enough pitch decks, with startups. Let me know if you want to look at it, and I give you some thoughts and some insights. And I have no background in nonprofit world really, besides just a lot of volunteer work. But worst case, hey, if it's not of any use, that's fine. But we had a few great conversations. She introduced me to some other members on the team, and that was it. I gave them a lot of ideas for what I thought could really help them focus on some things that they needed to do. And then that was a few weeks later, the war started. And Nina actually, she went there to go distribute teddy bears to children crossing the border. She had run her own nonprofit called Children of the Earth for decades. And she realized sometimes, when people are in these kind of refugee situations, they grab whatever they can, what they think is necessary. And a lot of times what they don't think of is what's the comfort for the children. And so that was phenomenal. She did that. And like a week later, she's like, I don't even think there was 1 million people in Poland. And she reached back out to me to pull me in. And actually I should stop. I've gotten way off of my background, but is that okay if I just jump right into the story?
I appreciate that. And the good news is our student moderator was having some technical issues in joining. Franco has joined, and Franco, thank you for moderating. I also wanted to congratulate Franco. He's one of our new Veale Snyder Fellows, which is a new entrepreneurship fellowship program that is launching this year. And Franco's in our inaugural class. So it's great to connect, Franco. And with that, let me turn it over to you to continue the conversation with Peter.
Yeah, no, great. Thank you so much, Michael. So it's funny because where I am, I'm in Argentina right now, and it's like the national holiday today because it's our like Independence Day. Well, our like national Argentina Day. And so we had a thunderstorm and everyone's just so slow. Everything's working so slowly because everyone's just celebrating. So it's I had a little bit of a technical issue because the power went out and I couldn't get the Wi-Fi on. But so thank you very much. Super excited to be here. Honestly, thank you for the opportunity. I am. And Peter's awesome. So I got the chance to speak to him yesterday a little bit, and he was actually telling me just this. It's his story. So if you actually, as Peter said, one of the biggest values and the biggest things that he's lately been interested in and involved in is social entrepreneurship for crisis situations. And so he was talking about Nina and how he came to meet her. So this is a person who's been 100% involved in, hard on startups and entrepreneurship in the business world. Could you maybe actually, before we get into the social entrepreneurship part, I remember when we spoke, it was a bit, you spoke a lot about how in the business world, it's not about helping people, but more about, how can the company progress and how can you make it, so you get more profit, or how is social entrepreneurship and in general entrepreneurship, how do they differ in that sense?
Well, and I'll have to step, because the whole nonprofits, and it actually is a new thing for me. And then, jumping in for a social cause in a time of crisis is new for me. But one of the things that I came across, so this is going back a little bit to what I'll just also give background, but is just seeing some of the research. I was in a role at SAP before, where I got to create fast facts, very broad. I created 1,000 of these basically points for how is our software relevant, for people around the world. Because most people, if they're in the business world, they've heard of SAP. We're the 800-pound gorilla, but we're kind of like what Microsoft is to the consumer. That's the old company. They sell to everybody, but they're the old company. They're not exciting like Google or any of the new, technologies. And so how do you get past that perception and try to show relevance that if you're a yacht maker in Italy or a fragrance producer in Argentina or a machine shop in Brazil, what have we done with companies like you to make relevance? And so I did a lot of that work, but I also did a lot of research just to say, look, and what are these new technologies that are coming out? What are third parties saying about them, and et cetera? So a lot of this is all just to prove, SAP, create relevance, just create little, sound bites that people can use from the CEO in a keynote to a sales pitch to whatever it is. If it's a tagline in your email to get people, oh, I didn't know that. And as I did that, I also got to start to filtrate in some findings I was coming across doing my research that I found intriguing, and whether they were problems or opportunities. And some of the ones that stuck with me the most were, again, in this world of inequity, were some of the things along the lines of, hey, and this is US based, some of this information, some of it's global, but primarily US based. But if US is one of the, highest performing countries in the world, just expand it beyond. But GDP in the last 40, 50 years has grown well over 1,000%, only to be outpaced by executive compensation. And then if you remove the ends of the spectrum, all the people in between have been pretty much stagnant for all of those decades. And so there's been this enormous growth, but how it's being distributed has been far from unequal. And I'm a capitalist, I'm not a socialist. I'm not saying but you know what? No, the systems, there's something that's not working with that right now. And then you put into some of the fact of things that we're experiencing now, but 30, 40 years ago, 60 to 70% of the working force in the US were receiving a pension. And through that, they were invested in the stock market. That time frame ago, 40, 50 years ago, there were 5 working people for every person on Social Security. Now we're about 2.5 working people for every person on Social Security. And so you look at the things like, people's primary, retirement funds are no longer exist. What was meant and intended to be a government supplemental fund is getting crunched immensely. And if you look, if any of these things you looked at on its own, you're like, wow, this is going to have huge macro social effects. If you look at some of the stuff Ray Dalio does, and he talks about some of this stuff, you realize, hey, look, when people's economics go down, their stress level goes up and social unrest occurs. It's just point blank. But you look at some of this stuff and you look at like, well, wait a second, companies that actually give profit sharing or equity to their employees outperform their peers. There's so much research on it. And whether it's they have higher profitability, greater growth, or they're more resistant to a recession. They're like 4,000 times less likely to default on loans. And then you look at other things along the line of, okay, companies that have credit suites did a study of thousands of public companies, and companies that have 15% or more women in senior leadership have 50% higher profitability than companies that have 10% or less. That's a very low bar. It's a very low bar. And it's not just because you're hiring a woman, and there's similar types of research for minorities. It's because it's diversity of thought, diversity of imagination, diversity of how you attack a problem, how you execute against that problem, and empathy with employees. I've worked for men and women, and I do tend to find women are a little bit more empathetic most of the time. But at the end of the day, seeing some of that is like, look, this is a problem, but it's also an opportunity. How do we attack that? That's kind of what got me into this. Okay, what can I do to help affect macro change? Let me explore this. Let me, if I remove myself from worrying about having a job to make sure I'm paying the bills and look at just how can I affect change? What are those opportunities? That's what got me on this journey. Of course, I started on the journey. I've had lots of personal family issues arise up, and because of my flexibility, I'm the one who helps take care of them, which I'm immensely thankful I have that flexibility and that ability. But through that process, that's how I got connected to a lot of different people including the Hope Makers group where I met Nina.
Yeah, so when you started, like, I guess, I mean, especially for newer faces in entrepreneurship, you don't really know. You're kind of just trying to get things done and speaking about profits and percentages. But then when you actually start to really like look at the bigger picture and look at actual numbers and facts, you start realizing that even from a foundational standpoint of any startup or any company, any big company, it's always important to keep purpose and some kind of like diversity and environmental responsibility in check, and that will help you in the long run a lot more. In fact, one of the information that you sent with me that you were talking about was, for example, companies that share profits or equity with their employees achieve like 12% higher ROE, which is super interesting because that's, you know,
a lot of companies go. And so once you went into, once you met Nina, right? So you started out working with companies.
Yeah.
Hard. My mic must have bugged out. Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So there you go.
Once you started working with companies, then you met Nina, right? This super interesting activist, you know, who's got, you know, involved in so many children's hospitals and so many activities. And you started noticing all these differences and that social entrepreneurship can do. What was the moment that made you turn and want to help her out in Ukraine?
Well, oh, okay. Well, yeah. So it was just helping with their nonprofit, One Humanity Institute. And it just looking at their pitch deck, their website, and there's a lot of similarities. And just, I'll give a very quick, One Humanity Institute arose out of basically Auschwitz. And the thought being millions of people visit Auschwitz every year. And to call it depressing is a huge understatement. It's just an overwhelming emotional experience. You just, you don't, like, what do? You just, there's nothing words can say or you could feel. It's just an example of part of the worst of humanity. And so their thought was they wanted to create, there's some unused former military housing right nearby that they wanted to create a quote unquote city of hope. They wanted to pull out of, look, what were some of the stories of hope that actually came from survivors of Auschwitz? What are some of the big examples of the best of humanity, the best of, hope? And whether it's startups, nonprofits, bring fellows in, have discussion groups that anyone, can go and attend. So after they go and see Auschwitz and they get very emotional, they get a chance to come over to the quote unquote city of hope and get exposed and actually join in opportunities to learn about a lot of the great and amazing things going on around the world. And how do we help connect people to, we all belong. The belonging and a lot of the mental health things, is one of the big things that's out there. We all belong to this one humanity, and there's things that bind us all together. And how do you help connect people with that? And so I thought that was really intriguing. But I figured my engagement after I gave them, spent some time with them, gave them advice, was really going to be, that's it. If you want me to go on and continue to give advice as you go forward, I'd be more than happy to. When the war broke out, and after she went and was delivering, giving teddy bears out, she came back a couple of weeks later and realized, look, there's a huge refugee problem. This is very early on when there's just hundreds of thousands. She's like, it's overwhelming and it's going to swamp the country. They're going to need housing. She said, we were donated a couple of buildings that they're like 100 years old. But if we fix them up and furnish them, this could be housing for refugees. We have no money. We have no full-time employees. And there's not really a CEO. There's kind of like a board of directors. Again, if you think of where they were as a nonprofit, they had this concept. They were working with the Polish government, with the Auschwitz, officials, and going on, how can we make this a reality? And that's obviously a much larger picture than fixing up housing. And so they're like, but we think we can make this happen. But I mean, you heard the situation, no money, no full-time employees, no real CEO,
Sounds a lot like a startup.
Well, it sounds like a startup, except there's no CEO. The very first thing I told her is like, you know what? No investor is going to invest in a startup without a CEO. And so she's like, well, we can't obviously afford. And when I say there's no CEO, there's also her and her co-founder. They both have full-time, Domen, who is Slovenian, he's the other co-founder. He has 2 companies that he's created, that he's running. So he's swamped. the quote unquote project lead, who actually lives in Oświęcim, which is English, we might pronounce it Oświęcim, but it's Oświęcim. That's Polish for, and Auschwitz is the German name for the city. But she lives there. She has her own architectural firm that she runs. And so these people are just, they're swamped. And I kind of, there's something in me, I mean, I've never done this kind of thing before, but there's something that said, like, look, if I can just go, I don't know exactly what it is. I'm not a carpenter. I'm not a nonprofit. I've never worked with refugees, but these people that have said, look, we've got, they took that first step. We've got these buildings. We have none of the rest of it figured out, but we're going to go start on this process and somehow it'll work. And I was like, I have a feeling this is going to break unless they have someone there to help them stabilize, you know, in this time frame. And if I can't go just for a week or two, this is not a Habitat for Humanity project, because there is no one there. You know, there's no one, you know, running the show. So just go help and be a stabilizing factor with them and do whatever it is I can figure out to do. And that's, you know, and I'll figure it out as I go. And that's what it is. That's the similarity to startups. The one difference would be how many people would jump into a startup without any other full-time employees or CEOs, you know?
And it's great that you mentioned that, actually, because could you speak about, so there was a story you told me specifically about this lady who was great, awesome, super dedicated to the cause, but she broke down crying and after the first day because she was so overwhelmed with things, and the type of personality, and more than anything, the skills necessary in order to conduct such an endeavor. If you'd like to speak about that. Yeah,
and I'll have to, that's a good point. And so one thing I mentioned is, not only is there no one full time, none of these people, with the exception maybe of Doman, are startup people. And maybe Nina to a certain degree, but she's in the US. They're not startup people. In Poland, from a lot of my exposure, there's some amazing people. I mean, I don't know if you've heard, there's, I don't know, millions of refugees have been taken into just individuals' homes. Just people saying, I'll take someone. No official form, just come stay with me. And it's overwhelming, but I think there's a lot of history there too, because both Poland and Ukraine, you know, they went through the Nazi regime and then they went through the Soviet regime, and they've been through that. And so there's kind of like a brotherhood of those countries of having survived through some of those. But yeah, when I was first there and I was starting to meet people, and luckily Doman was able to be around a handful of days the first week I got there, because he spoke English well. This other woman, Kashi, she's the project manager, she's the architect. She speaks English, but not always so well. There were numerous misunderstandings throughout, I would say, and not necessarily bad, just I think and some of it was just language, but some of it was also cultural. You know, I think a lot of the exposure I got, and well, there's going back and forth, but she would be phenomenal at a large company, you know, but it's and even to a certain degree, they very think hierarchical, which is not what you need to have in a startup. You need to be very flat. You need to distribute responsibility. And so I very early figured out, you know what, that's fine. Let me figure out, you know, what I can, what decisions I can and can't do on my own, and I'll maximize and optimize those. But yeah, but one of the first times I met her, she broke down crying, and she's like, this is like a full-time job on top of me trying to run my company. And she's also a single mom trying to raise her child, you know, run a company, and she's doing all of this work on the side. And so she's the one who actually went and found contractors and started the work before there was any money in the bank. And so, you know, it was the heart that all these people have is immense, you know. And if you come in and you look at it from a strictly business perspective, you could get frustrated with just the situation. You're like, you know what, because they're not startup people, there's not distribution of necessarily just people being able to make decisions on their own for certain things. Be like, you know, this is, you know, our end goal is what we're going for, and this is the team we have. And they started with that very first decision, I'm going to go for it. You know, it's one thing that this is better than a startup is that there's an absolute need. Every company, every startup company hopes that they have an absolute need in the market, but it's not always guaranteed. You know, they think they've done their research, whatever they're finding, maybe if they're in a unique situation, they actually have it, but there's an absolute need here. And it's the market supply has been saturated, so the need was immense. So, but yeah, it's very very interesting in that regards. And so, I mean, I could go right into some other things from jump off of that, or I don't know if you had another specific question, but
let's open up to questions from the public. Do we have any questions from the people that are here? Oh, Robert, who raised your hand. Is that a question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Oh, yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, so Peter, I just think it's interesting. You had no experience, working with a refugee crisis or building housing. And what is it about, your startup experience that you think helped? Like, what part of a refugee crisis feels like a startup?
The uncertainty, there's so many things to get done, and you start off not knowing hardly any of them. You can hypothesize on what you think needs to get done, but you also have to get into the situation. And so, so much of my experience has been baptism by fire, and it's not always startup. Some of it's can call it entrepreneurship, say at SAP with new product launches, but there are startups that I've been with. It's like you have to just go and figure it out. And I think, the very first thing I started doing was, well, let me connect. Who are other people out there that could help us? And I very quickly, that's every company I've ever been with. That's what I do. And whether it's internal operations, people on the go-to-market phase, potential customers, potential partners, within the value chain, who are all the players, what's going on, where those opportunities or issues as they describe it. And then you start putting all those pieces together. I can't tell you how many hundreds of organizations, nonprofits, government official, et cetera. I got zero. And I don't know if that's just because no one knows who I am, they're overloaded. I got the impression that Poland works exceptionally different than any place else I've been. I would get zero on this. I'd get zero on, Signal outreach or WhatsApp outreach, even if I had intros from people. But if you walked into somebody's office, unscheduled appointment, knocked on their door, they would actually talk to you and they wouldn't be upset. And to me, that's like rude. Like, no, you can't, I want to give you, that's why I'm sending you an email or an outreach first to see if this, and plus you want to see, does this even make sense? And so that was extraordinarily frustrating, but you had to overcome that and just figure out, okay, well, what works and what's not working, and just keep moving forward. And that's the same in a startup. You have to always take a little bit of time for reflection, but you have to move. You can't do everything. You've got to hit that point, that Pareto level of whatever it is, 60, 70, 80% of the knowledge that you think you're going to get, and make a decision and move. And then you'll course correct as you have to. But I found a lot of that is very similar. And there's obviously, there are failure points, and that's going to happen, but hopefully you have, and we were, it's like celebrate every little success we had. Every time we got something done, try to do that. And that's, I'm not a social media person at all. If you looked at my account before I went over there, it's probably been years since I posted anything. And I tell people I probably posted more while I was there than I did the rest of my life, because if you need to get people engaged, people need to know. There's no one else knows about One Humanity Institute or what they're specifically doing with these buildings of housing. And just a part of my life. But through doing that got other people engaged. It got other people saying, hey, can I come over and help volunteer? Hey, I'd like to make a donation. Hey, because this is something unique and specific. It's not just, everyone, and I've always tried to give, to the Red Cross or to whatever group is doing something, but that's just going off into the big Ethereum. Whereas people, when they saw something very specific, very tangible, like, oh, this is really cool. I'm helping to pay for some of those contractors that are fixing the walls in that house that Peter's in, or I'm helping buy a refrigerator, or I'm helping buy a bed, or I'm buying sheets and towels, whatever it is, I'm helping doing something very tactical and specific that's unique. And I've got a connection, whether it's through me, through my wife, through one of the other volunteers that got engaged. And so, so that's a little bit different. I can't say I really did that kind of thing before. I did internal communications before. Well, lots of communications. in a startup, because you have to let people know. That's one of the biggest things. Everyone's got to know what's going on so that they can voice, I see an opportunity, I see an issue, or can I help, or whatever. But also there's the outward communication. The group that I was talking to, they were having conversations with people that could donate millions in the past. But those are long-term conversations, things that take years for people to kind of commit to. And I must admit, there was some frustration on my part. It's like, well, someone is talking to you about giving millions. Can they give 1% of that for now? And they're like, the hoops are the same you have to go through, whether it's, the full amount or just a small fraction of it. So, but I found just by being there, and my friends, family, the volunteers I was able to bring in, the networks I was able to bring in, and then their friends and family and their networks, probably helped raise about $80,000 and got the group over the hump of what's kind of the bare minimum we need to get this ready to bring people in. I mean, it's an ongoing process, because the building is, to be quite honest, the easiest part. Once you have people in there, then it's how do you help them? And I think that's where One Humanity Institute, with their longer term vision they talked about, there are some similarities that what they're thinking of. Once we start bringing people in, we want it to be a hub, not just for the people that live there, but a hub for other refugees. And then whether it's, it could be Syrian refugees from before, they could come and live there potentially too. But just not just refugees, the local town people, like whatever it is. So obviously, if it's grief or trauma therapy, that's more relevant to the people that are experiencing or have experienced it. But if it's job skill training or job placement opportunities or language skills, that's applicable to anyone. And they want to have kind of create a hub, like come in and do this, partake, let us hopefully be a hub for some of this to take place and happen and help other people. And so anyway, so that's, I got a little bit off topic, but yeah, there are a lot of similarities with a startup. And then there's some dissimilarities. And actually, the other one I should bring up too is not very many startups have the kind of potential time pressure that I think. I mean, a lot of startups have, hey, we have to try to be first to market or one of the early adopters or whatnot. But this is like, what, the need is there. They had 4 million people, over 4 million people in country last month. And so, and it just continues to evolve. So, but
yeah, that's something I was going to highlight actually, that in all of this that you've been mentioning, all this effort, like the need is there, whether you're successful in your endeavor or not. Michael, you had a question?
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Franco. And Peter, thanks for a great conversation. I wanted to talk in this sort of sphere of social entrepreneurship, solving a challenge like the work that you were doing in Ukraine through a nonprofit organization and fundraising through things like GoFundMe for donations to come in. Another way that social entrepreneurs solve problems, and actually we have colleagues at Case Western that work at our Fowler Center, it's business as an agent of world benefit. So social entrepreneurs that choose to start a for-profit company to solve a problem. I mean, it sounds like kind of given the nature of the kind of work that was needed and the speed of which it was needed to scale, and to some degree the structure of the home organization. I mean, it's set up as a not-for-profit and it's donation driven.
right.
As you've gotten involved in this world, this sort of decision that social entrepreneurs need to make, whether to try to solve the problems through a nonprofit and seek donations versus starting a business that may solve that problem. Did the work in the Ukraine kind of give you any additional insights in that decision point that social entrepreneurs need to sort of weigh and how to solve a social issue?
Yeah, that's a tough. Well, I just think in my previous to be involved with One Humanity Institute consideration, I adopted the name Capital Purpose and thinking through, I want companies to be able to figure this out. And part of it is if you're a nonprofit, companies look at you differently. There are people that if you say do what's right, that's a very subjective thing. And if you're just in a lot of the conscious capitalist type organizations are out there, there's a lot of people that believe in doing what's right and they'll pay for it. The vast majority of companies and investors, they want a return. But if you can prove to them, look, there is a greater return if you do what's right. I think that's one of the things that's out there. But within specifically working with One Humanity Institute, I mean, that's a very valid thing that we look at too. It is a nonprofit. They're already, registered in the US and in Poland. But we looked at this is not sustainable if, I'm helping doing some fundraising, but my network's kind of been tapped, there's other fundraising that they're doing, but to be sustainable longer term, you've got to figure out what are the revenue streams. You can't just, do this indefinitely, but it's also, we looked at, and so at some point in time, we said, hey, anyone that's living there, if you have the ability to pay X dollars per person per month, and it was something small, like 50 or 60 euros per month, that would help cover the bare costs for operations. But there are certain government benefits they can apply for. But that was one of the things we had to look at is to be sustainable, you can't just expect a handout all of the time to come your way. And so we had to always kind of look at what is that. But at the same time, these people, we use the term transitional housing. What does that mean? Obviously there's something they have to cope with the most recent history they've lived through and are currently living through. But there's also, what are they hoping to transition to when the war ends? That's one of the biggest things. Do you want to go home? Are you thinking you want to try to stay in Poland? Do you want to go to some other country? Or are you undecided? And so how can we help people figure out, regardless of what path that is, or figure out what path makes the most sense for them, depending on what's going on. And it can be undecided because the war is not over. And, have they lost a loved one yet? Or multiple loved ones? Do they have a home, go back? There's a lot of unknowns within that. And so, but you had to have those kind of conversations. And I think there's probably a year, maybe two, that they can get by on just donations. But then after that, they've got to figure out how can they make money? How can they actually make this work? And it's a nonprofit, doesn't mean it's not make money, but it's pay for the operations itself, so it can be sustainable long-term. But absolutely, yeah.
And it's cool because all of this that you've been speaking about, one humanity, because after all, we are one humanity. We are overall one society. Companies should take part of this. In fact, over 70% of consumers would pay a 35% premium for brands that are sustainable and responsible. And so sometimes doing the right thing is fiscally responsible, just how you mentioned. So we are running a bit short on time. We're trying to end at 12:45. So we'll have our last question by Robert, right? And you have your hand raised? Do you have a question?
I do, and can you hear me?
Yes.
It's
We can
it's
hear
a
you.
little unfair because, as you said, you're not sure, what the people need, but I'm wondering, what kind of impact have you had? Did you get a sense?
Well, that's one of the toughest things is while I was there, I was working on primarily physical structure, but how do they plan and think about, what needs to be done in the future and go towards that. And so I made sure, hey, I want to make sure I have engagement. So I handed out hundreds of teddy bears myself.
Okay.
I would talk to people and get those. So I posted some of the stories, and some of it was, I would just meet refugees. And the very first thing is they hate the feeling, they hate the term of being refugees, but it's true. But and usually half the people I met were because they would get to stay for anywhere from 3 to 5 days at the hotel that I was in. But they didn't know, and they wanted to enjoy. Look, we're not in a shopping mall full with thousands of cots and thousands of other people. We're in a nice place. We want to enjoy this. And so you're hesitant, but having the teddy bears is kind of the icebreaker, and you just be able to give it to them, have those conversations, give them a sense of normalcy. And it was great. I mean, for whatever moment in time, those kids and those parents' eyes would light up. That was great. But to be honest, there were parents, there were grandparents sometimes that you'd give a teddy bear to. And they felt the immense outpouring of gratitude from them, just that somebody else cares, was amazing. I'm so glad. But also when I was there, I mentioned I reached out to people, and over time I would slowly start to make connections, and you would find out, hey, this group is doing this, and this group is collecting it. Like, hey, can you get together? Like, here's an opportunity. You need this. These people have that, make those connections. a friend of mine here that runs a nonprofit that works with soccer, basically with refugees in the US, but also in Africa. They bring kids in and they mentor them. He gave me a whole bunch of balls, pennies, cones, and bag to hold it in. And, everywhere I handed those out, people, kids were just ecstatic, and instantly games would start up. But I also found a club that was bringing in Ukrainian children, letting them play for free again, so they would have a sense of normalcy. And then I connected different people that had children that didn't know about that. Actually, there was a Ukrainian refugee that was helping us volunteer before he got a full-time job, but we helped connect. His son was able to go and play with the team. And it's like, that's awesome. You know what? And so you take every one of those small little connections you have, and you're like, what? I'm glad I was able to make that connection. May that have happened if I wasn't there? I don't know, but it did happen because I was there, and so the timing of when it might have happened. And there's other things. There's actually one of our volunteers that we brought in. He actually, and he's from Pittsburgh as well. He found another small group of drivers that are driving food into East Ukraine. And it's very secret. You can't, and he helped, and via another partner that we had found otherwise, help make a connection that they would help fund these drivers to buy food and bring it to Ukraine. And there's just all sorts of these little bitty connections. Because one thing, after all of this time, there's still not a lot of coordination. And that's the most frustrating thing. There's like, it's phenomenal that the hotels system seemed to work to give people that brief respite of a 3 to 5 day at a nice hotel. But how do you get, people talk about Airbnb. I talk to Airbnb owners and like, I'll maybe, if you talk to me about it, maybe I'll have the opportunity that I could let someone in at a discounted price. And I was trying to see if I can raise money. I've heard there's millions of dollars set aside for that, but how do you get engaged? There's no communication. There's no transparency. There's no list of, who are all the organizations that are finding homes? And it's all ad hoc, done all over the place. And that's one of the greatest frustrations. But it's like, you can only control what you can and do what you can. So I was happy that I was able to get in, and in the network I was able to make connections with. There are good things that happen. I'd love to do more. And we keep trying to do more. So, but
taken out of context is, again, it sounds like a startup. Some of the things you're saying is just, it's funny. So we'll have Michael for a closing, but I just wanted to add a quick note. It's crazy. It's amazing. All these things you're saying, just how a purpose brings people together like that, from all the different backgrounds, different languages, and how entrepreneurs can make all this happen. So I'm definitely, for example, for my life, will definitely consider and try to bring this into my endeavors. So that was inspiring. Thank you very much, Peter.
Well, I need to think, I'm going to miss people I know, but all the different volunteers that came in, Ed, Brian, Allison, Shelby, Kate, Jose, and so many more. And then Brian actually helped bring in the Pittsburgh Technology Council and connect. He's got an immense network, and Allison, Audrey, I'm sorry. And then they brought in Brother's Brother, who helped us out in an immense number of ways. So I just want to, and there's so many different people in Oświęcim in Poland that are helping as well too. There was a Russian couple that came in and helped that I was initially very worried about them helping and getting, targeted. Because of that, and there's people from all over the place that are coming to help. Cuba, so Anna, Dimitri, all of you, and everyone I'm forgetting. Bruce, I'm sure I'm forgetting people. I apologize, but thank you very much. So, and all of the kids from the Kognaska High School. I know I butchered it. Olga and Kasha and the rest of the team.
Awesome.
Dziękuję.
Well, Franco, thank you for moderating. Glad and happy Celebration Day in Argentina, whatever you guys are celebrating. I'm glad your internet connection came back. Peter, thanks for doing this. What a great way to share the story again. Thanks to our partners at the Case Alumni Association and Bob Smith, who's here, who initially
Thank you, Michael and Bob,
that you were doing in Poland. And yeah, look forward to continuing to hear about the journey. There's so much work to be done, and the fact that you were able to bring your skills and the entrepreneurship skill world broadly defined to apply to help folks with real housing needs. It's really exciting to hear. So thank you for the work that you did and for sharing the story today.
Well, thank you. And hopefully, yeah, someone comes across this and realizes, but it's a huge opportunity, and people from the startup world have a unique skill set that I think can be applied in these kind of situations that a lot of people don't realize. It's extremely valuable.
Interesting. Well, we will be back next week. We just confirmed, so keep an eye on our posts. Brittany Billingsley, who's the head of selection for Amazon Fresh Grocery. Brittany's a double alum of the MBA program in our law school. We'll talk about her journey, and she's done a number of interesting things in her career, from American Greetings to Eaton to now her work at Amazon. So that'll be next Wednesday, same time at 12 noon Eastern. So thank you everybody for joining, and hope to see you next week.
Thank you,
I
everyone.
translated it. It was Homeland Day. That's the name.
Homeland Day. Okay. Happy Homeland Day.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody.